Picture the main street of Dodge City in the summer of 1878. Not the cinematic version. No heroic silhouette backlit by a blazing sunset. No clean-shaven lawmen squaring off in slow motion. What you get instead is a wall of heat that hits you like an open oven door the second you step off the train. The air carries the smell before anything else reaches you. Cattle waste, horse sweat, tallow smoke from a nearby cook fire, and underneath all of it, the faint medicinal sting of whiskey that seems to have soaked into the wooden planks of every building along Front Street. The dust is not a background detail. It is a constant living presence. Fine red-brown particles that coat your teeth within the first hour, settle into the creases of your collar, and cake into a thin crust at the corners of your eyes by mid-bay. There is no escaping it. The streets are not paved. The sidewalks are wooden boards laid over bare earth. When the wind picks up from the southwest, and it always does in Kansas, you pull your hat down low, turn your face, and breathe through your teeth. This was the real American West. Not a myth, not a legend, a place where ordinary human beings, men and women dragging families, ambitions, and desperation across a continent, tried to build something from almost nothing, under conditions that modern life has made nearly impossible to imagine. The cities of the Wild West are burned into the American consciousness as symbols. Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood, Abilene. We think we know them. We have seen them in 1,000 films, 1,000 novels, 1,000 dime store illustrations. But the reality of daily existence in those places, the texture of it, the smell, the physical toll, is something that rarely survives the journey from history to legend. What actually happened when someone woke up in Deadwood, South Dakota in the winter of 1877? What did they eat? What did they wear? Where did they relieve themselves at 2 a.m. when the temperature had dropped below zero? How did a woman running a boarding house in Abilene manage the competing pressures of cattle season commerce, personal safety, and the basic dignity of keeping herself and her establishment presentable under conditions that made both nearly impossible? These are not dramatic questions. They are the questions that most closely resemble actual life, and they are the ones that history has always been slowest to answer. The cattle towns of Kansas, Abilene, Dodge City, Caldwell, Wichita, existed in a narrow window of time, roughly the 1860s through the late 1880s, when the convergence of the railroads, open-range cattle drives from Texas, and the appetite of eastern markets created a peculiar, violent, and temporary economy. Abilene was first. Joseph McCoy arrived in 1867, spotted the terminus of the Kansas Pacific Railroad, and essentially built a cattle shipping operation from a handful of log cabins. Within a season, Texas cowboys were driving herds of longhorns northward along what would become the Chisholm Trail, and Abilene exploded into a settlement of perhaps 1,000 permanent residents, supporting the seasonal chaos of tens of thousands of cattle and the men who drove them. It was not a town designed for comfort. It was designed for transaction. The physical layout of these Kansas cattle towns followed a logic of commercial urgency. The railroad track was the spine. Nearest to the depot sat the stockyards, the scale houses, the commission firms where cattle were weighed, counted, and sold. Behind those ran the saloons, hotels, gambling houses, and general stores that absorbed the money before it could leave town. At the periphery, often literally across the tracks or at the end of a side street, lived the permanent residents, families, tradespeople, laundresses, blacksmiths, who provided the infrastructure on which the seasonal economy depended, but who occupied a carefully maintained social distance from its most visible excesses. The buildings themselves were strikingly provisional. Wooden frames went up in weeks, clad in green lumber that warped and split as it dried through its first summer. Gaps between planks were real problems in winter when the temperature in western Kansas could fall to 20 below zero, and the wind drove cold through every imperfect joint in the construction. Many establishments were insulated with layers of newspaper pastured to interior walls, not as decoration, but as actual weatherproofing. The newspapers yellowed, curled, and eventually peeled, leaving the walls with a patchy, faded texture that visitors from more established eastern cities found disorienting. Heat was managed with wood-burning cast-iron stoves positioned in the center of the main room. They overheated the space nearest them and left the corners cold. A typical room in Abilene, in the cattle season hotel in the early 1870s, might hold a rope-strung wooden bed frame with a straw or corn husk mattress, a single hook on the wall for hanging clothes, and if the establishment was relatively prosperous, a small pitcher of water and a ceramic basin on a stand. The pitcher was refilled once a day, sometimes less. Bathtubs existed in the better establishments,
25
usually
cents for a
tin or
bath
copper, portable,
extra for
dragged
hot
to a
water.
room and filled by someone
Reckon I'll
carrying
take
water
both.
heated on the kitchen stove. But access to one cost money and time, and the water was shared serially among multiple guests, each user paying for a few minutes of warmth before the water cooled and the next person came in. Cowboys who arrived at the end of a cattle drive, 3 to 4 months out of Texas, their skin creased with trail dust, their hair matted under hat-shaped pressure, their clothes carrying the accumulated sweat and grime of hundreds of miles of open-range travel, often headed directly to whatever passed for a bathhouse before anything else. The bathhouse was a legitimate commercial enterprise, and in the cattle towns it was busy. Men generally wore their hair long enough to fall over their collar, partly because barbers were scarce. Lice were a recognized, almost accepted occupational hazard, not a mark of particular personal failure, but a consequence of the conditions. The common treatment involved combs, patience, and preparations involving kerosene, which were effective but left the scalp irritated and the hair smelling of petroleum for days. Shaving required a clean razor, water, soap, and time. And in the working day of a cattle drive cowboy or a Deadwood miner, the necessary combination was assembled maybe once or twice a week, if that. In Deadwood, the calculus of daily hygiene was made considerably more difficult by the geography. The Black Hills settlement exploded after the discovery of gold in 1874, and by 1876, the town had grown from nothing to a crowded, chaotic collection of perhaps 5,000 people, compressed into a narrow gulch between steep, pine-covered hills.
Morning, Mac.
The single main
Morning,
street was
Lice.
barely wide enough for two
What's
wagons
lumber?
to pass with mutual
Seems
caution.
wider than
On
last
either
week.
side, buildings rose in improvised layers up the slopes, tents behind wooden storefronts, log cabins wedged between frame buildings, canvas roofing where permanent material had not yet arrived. Water came from Whitewood Creek, which ran through the center of the gulch and served simultaneously as the town's primary water source and its primary sewer. The public health implications of this arrangement were not invisible to the people who lived there. They were simply unavoidable given the rate at which the town had grown and the near total absence of municipal
Well, here's
infrastructure.
to another day.
The miners who poured into Deadwood were overwhelmingly men, mostly
Goddamn
young,
cold.
from every background and region, veterans of the Civil War who had never found a stable footing in the Reconstruction economy, immigrants from Germany and Ireland and China who had worked their way across the continent following one extraction economy after another, farmers' sons from the Midwest who heard stories and believed them. They worked the placer claims and the hard rock mines in shifts that lasted as long as the light or the torchlight allowed, with picks, shovels, and sluice boxes in water cold enough to numb the hands within minutes. The physical toll was immediate and severe. Hands cracked and bled, knees wore down from hours of crouching. The camps along the creeks outside town offered minimal shelter, tents staked into rocky ground, sleeping 2 or 3 men on layers of blankets and pine boughs, the fire built outside and allowed to die by morning. Food in the mining camps was repetitive in a way that a modern palate would find almost confrontational. Beans, dried, boiled until soft, seasoned with salt pork, were the staple of countless meals. Sourdough bread, where the starter had been carefully maintained across hundreds of miles of travel, was a genuine luxury compared to hardtack, the dense cracker-like squares of flour and water that could survive months without spoiling because there was almost nothing in them to spoil. Coffee was drunk in industrial quantities, usually boiled directly in the pot until it was nearly thick, consumed more for the warmth and the familiar ritual than for any refined pleasure. Fresh vegetables were extraordinarily rare in the early years of a mining camp. Scurvy was a documented medical reality in some frontier settlements. When fresh fruit or vegetables arrived with a supply wagon, they commanded prices that seemed absurd but reflected the genuine desperation of people whose gums had started to soften. Tombstone, Arizona territory was a different kind of place, and its differences were instructive. Founded in 1877 after Ed Schiffelin's silver discovery, the town grew with implausible speed into a settlement of several thousand people by the early 1880s, complete with newspapers, theatrical performances, multiple churches, and the social complexity that follows when a substantial population with divergent interests is crammed into a small space with no established legal tradition to manage them. The Sonoran Desert brought its own punishment in the form of heat that exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit in summer, scorpions in your boots if you did not check them before putting them on, and a dry air that cracked lips, pulled moisture from flour, and turned leather into something that snapped rather than bent. Mine owners and their families in Tombstone wore clothing shipped from San Francisco or New York, men in wool suits with proper collars and cuffs, women in fashions only a season or two behind what was appearing in eastern cities. The aspiration to respectability was strong and visible, displayed deliberately in a place where the most of the surrounding landscape offered nothing but hard edges and dust. Underneath those aspirational surfaces, however, the same basic conditions prevailed. Laundry was done mostly by Chinese laundries that charged fees most residents paid grudgingly as the only reliable alternative to doing it themselves, which meant hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing, rinsing, and hanging in a desert wind that deposited more dust onto the fabric while it dried. The social geography of all these frontier towns was organized around divisions that everyone understood without requiring them to be stated. There was the respectable district, churches, schools, homes of permanent families. There was the vice district, confined to one side of the railroad tracks in cattle towns, and which in mining towns sometimes seemed to represent more square footage than anything else. Saloons were not simply bars, they were the central social institutions of a population that had very few others. Men gambled, drank, argued, conducted business, read newspapers aloud, listened to music, and occasionally killed one another in these spaces. The violence, however, was far less common than the mythology suggests. In many cattle town seasons, the murder rate, while genuinely higher than in settled eastern communities, was not the daily carnage that dime novels preferred to describe. Women navigated these spaces according to a set of rules that were rigid in ways that benefited men and burdensome in ways that fell entirely on women. A woman of respectable standing in Tombstone or Abilene was expected to confine her movements largely to the domestic sphere, her own household, the houses of other respectable families, the church, the dry goods store. Stepping into a saloon or a gambling house, even with a legitimate errand, carried social costs that most women could not afford to pay. This confinement was enforced not by law, but by the far more effective mechanism of social judgment, and the consequences, loss of reputation, loss of standing, and loss of the social connections on which economic survival often depended, was severe enough to function as an almost complete deterrent. For women who worked in the saloon and vice economy, as dance hall girls, as prostitutes, as madams, the material conditions varied enormously. Some parlor house madams in places like Dodge City accumulated substantial wealth and genuine autonomy. Many more were trapped in circumstances of debt, coercion, and physical danger from which escape was extremely difficult. The popular romanticization of these women as free-spirited figures of the frontier does a specific and identifiable disservice to the reality of their lives, which involved constant negotiation of physical safety, social stigma, economic exploitation, and health risks, syphilis, gonorrhea, unwanted pregnancy, all managed with medical resources that fell somewhere between minimal and almost non-existent. Medicine in the Wild West was a topic that would have inspired dark humor from anyone living through it. Doctors did practice in frontier towns, genuine medical men with some degree of formal training, but they were outnumbered by patent medicine peddlers, self-taught practitioners, and people who simply applied whatever they learned from their mothers and hoped for the best. Whiskey was legitimate surgical anesthetic. Laudanum was prescribed for pain with a generosity that created addiction as a common medical side effect. Wound care consisted largely of cleaning with what was available and hoping infection did not follow. It often did. A gunshot wound to the abdomen was almost certainly fatal, not from the bullet itself, but from the peritonitis that followed when probing with unsterilized instruments was the standard of care. Compound fractures led to amputations with a regularity that left frontier communities with a statistically visible proportion of one-armed and one-legged inhabitants. One of the deepest misunderstandings about the Wild West is the idea that it was a white world.
The popular mythology of the frontier is overwhelmingly white and male, and this mythology has been so thoroughly absorbed into the culture that it functions almost invisibly as a distortion. The cattle drives that fed Abilene and Dodge City employed a workforce that was roughly a third black and a third Mexican. Many of the most skilled cowboys, whose rope work and horsemanship were the envy of the trail, were black men working under conditions that paid less than their white counterparts for the same work, navigating the social landscape of the cattle towns under a combination of risks that their white colleagues did not share. Chinese immigrants in the Black Hills mining camps formed communities that were simultaneously indispensable and subject to a casual, sometimes violent racism that expressed itself in targeted taxation, legal exclusion, and periodic physical assault.
Native American peoples occupy the frame of this story as its most profound tragedy, the one that the mythology of the frontier consistently elides. Every one of these settlements existed on land whose prior inhabitants had been pushed aside, broken by treaty or by force, or were still actively resisting. The Black Hills, considered sacred by the Lakota, were invaded following Custer's 1874 expedition and the confirmation of gold deposits, an act that violated the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 with a directness that was noted at the time by everyone, and that nonetheless proceeded because the appetite for gold was stronger than any legal commitment. The resulting conflict is the background against which Deadwood existed in its earliest and most chaotic years, and it is inseparable from any honest account of what life there was like. Returning to the daily and the physical, the end of a day in any of these cities arrived with a quality of exhaustion that has no precise modern analog. Kerosene lamps cast a yellow, flickering glow that was hard to read by and produced a continuous thin stream of black smoke that left a faint, oily residue on every surface it touched. The lampblack accumulating on ceilings and walls required periodic whitewashing, itself a significant labor. Sleep in a frontier town was not the private, quiet, controlled experience that contemporary life promises. Hotels were loud, saloons operated through most of the night. Animals moved through the unpaved streets at all hours, their sounds filtering through the thin walls of frame construction. Shared rooms were the norm in cheaper accommodations. Snoring, coughing, the sounds of men shifting on rope-strung beds that creaked with every movement were the ambient soundtrack of a night's rest. Bedbugs were sufficiently common that travelers developed habits around checking mattresses before committing to a room, and certain hotels advertised their freedom from the insects as a genuine selling point. The sanitation infrastructure of these towns represents perhaps the largest single gulf between frontier life and the experience of modern cities. Outhouses at the back of properties, shared between adjacent businesses, in the summer heat of Dodge City or Tombstone were not a minor inconvenience. Their smell was a constant, heavy presence. Flies moved between the privy and the kitchen with complete freedom and absolutely no understanding of the implications. Typhoid fever was a documented killer in frontier settlements. Garbage collection as a municipal service did not exist. Refuse was thrown into the street, burned in backlots, or allowed to accumulate in patterns that followed the logic of the least resistance. Dogs and hogs roamed freely in many settlements, performing a kind of informal recycling function that was entirely practical in the absence of alternatives. The ground surface of the frontier Main Street was a complicated geological record of everything dropped, spilled, or abandoned over the course of a season. Manure, straw, food scraps, broken glass, nails, all worked into the dust by the constant traffic of hooves and boot heels. In the late afternoon of a long summer day in Dodge City, the light would shift to a low, amber angle that turned the dust hanging in the air into something almost beautiful. The sounds of the day would layer one over another, the distant bellowing of cattle in the stockyards, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer from the livery stable, the piano beginning in one of the saloons along Front Street, a train whistled from the direction of the depot, and in the middle of this, a woman carrying a basket of laundry back from the line behind her boarding house, walking carefully to avoid the worst of the mud near the horse trough, glancing up at the amber light with an expression that could have been anything: exhaustion, determination, a private pleasure in the beauty of a moment she would not have described in those terms, but felt nonetheless. This is what the Wild West actually was: a collection of provisional human settlements where people were making choices, building things, enduring conditions, and experiencing the full range of human emotion under constraints that the mythology has almost entirely replaced with simpler stories. The gunfights happened. They were real, and they mattered, and some of them changed the direction of particular lives in particular towns. But they happened inside a daily reality that was mostly composed of work, physical discomfort, improvised solutions, ordinary social friction, and the small, persistent dignities that people manufacture for themselves when the alternatives are too bleak to contemplate. The frontier was not a fantasy, it was a life, and like most lives, it was harder, more complicated, and more human than any legend has managed to contain.